In this video, we're going to cover the process of installing Visual Studio Code and implementing all of the necessary pieces to get .NET MAUI to work within Visual Studio Code. The very first thing that we need to do is we need to download Visual Studio Code. If we navigate to visualstudio.microsoft.com/downloads, scroll down to the bottom of the page. Within the Visual Studio Code section, there is a free download that is available. We would just need to pick our operating system from here to go through and download the installer. Once the installer is downloaded, then it would just be run, taking all the defaults. Now, I already have Visual Studio Code installed for other things, so I'm not necessarily going to download it and run through the installation process, but it's fairly straightforward. After we get done with the Visual Studio Code, we would then switch over to install the .NET 8 SDK. We're just going to go ahead and click on the button to do the installer. It's already almost done here. It should pop up momentarily. Once it pops up, we're going to go ahead and open the installer and run through the installation process. All right, we can go ahead and see that we've got the .NET Runtime installed. Close out. The next piece that we want to do is we want to download the Android Studio. There are other ways that we can get the Android emulators for working with Visual Studio, but this is quite simply the easiest way if we're not installing Visual Studio 2022. So I'm going to go ahead and download the Koala version. Scroll down to the very bottom, acknowledge that I have read the agreement, and click the install. Should be downloading it as we speak. Once it gets downloaded, then I will launch it. I'm going to go ahead and open the installer. Allow it to make changes to my device. Accept all the defaults. And allow it to restart the Android Studio. I'm going to choose to not send statistics to Google. And now we have the Android Studio open. The final piece that we need to install before we get into trying to add the extensions to Visual Studio Code and then ensuring that everything is configured quite right is we need to add the OpenJDK. If I go to the OpenJDK, I can get to it from the learn.microsoft.com/en-us/java/openjdk/download. And when we get to the OpenJDK 17, you would just go through, pick your OS. In my case, I have the Windows x64, so I'm going to go ahead and run the MSI. It's downloading right now. Should be popping up momentarily to run. I'm going to run the MSI then. Accept the terms. Just go ahead and take all of the defaults. And click Finish. Now we're going to go ahead and open up our Visual Studio Code. Take a look a little bit at the environment here. Initially, you should see a welcome screen. If you do not see the welcome screen, you can always access the welcome screen underneath the Help menu to bring it back up. We also have a set of menus across the top, one of which is the terminal, which we'll be using. We also have options down the side. Now, for whatever reason, my debug option has disappeared, and I haven't been able to get it back yet. I haven't really spent a whole lot of time looking for it. I still have the ability to run and debug through the run menu, so I'm not necessarily as concerned about that. What I want to do first is talk about the first icon. This is going to be our Explorer. This is going to contain all of our files. We can open a directory that contains files. We can also create files and add them to our folder structure. We'll be working within our folder structure here. We also have source control. We will be looking at source control in week 2, where we're going to clone repositories for our working assignments. We also have the ability from within a directory structure to search for text. And then if we decide that we want to replace all instances of a particular text within all files, we can do that using this powerful command here. The last icon that we see here is the extensions, and underneath the extensions, if we have anything already installed, which I have a number of extensions installed because I do development with Docker. I also teach PHP and JavaScript, so there are things in here for those things as well. And we need to add some more stuff for our .NET MAUI. We're going to go and search for .NET MAUI, and it's going to bring up .NET MAUI that we can go ahead and install. So when I click on the install, it's going to bring up some information about this particular extension. If we go to the dependencies, we can see that it has dependencies on C# and C# Dev Kit. If we expand those, we can see that each of these dependencies is based on the .NET install tool. We will get these 3 extensions installed when we install our .NET MAUI. If I go ahead and remove my search text, which will filter the list, and refresh, we can see that we have these 4 extensions that have been inserted and installed for our computer system. Now, if we go through, and I can already see that I can connect here and close. So this is going to connect me to my Microsoft account. You are required to have a Microsoft account. So if you do not have one, you need to go to the Microsoft website and obtain a Microsoft account so that you can connect to it. Once you are connected, this one should already be set up, but let's validate that we are set up with our install for .NET SDK. We are going to come into our terminal window and launch a new terminal where we can execute that command that it's showing here, .NET -- version. This should show us the version of .NET that we have installed, and we see that it is 8.0.303. The next thing that we want to do is related to our .NET MAUI and installing the SDK there. We need to do a .NET work list. We need to do a .NET workload list. So if we go ahead down here and do a .NET workload list, see that we don't have anything listed there. We should have the MAUI installed, and we do not see that there. So let's go ahead and do a .NET workload install MAUI. It's going to ask me if I want to make changes to my device. I'm going to say yes, and then it's going to continue to download a bunch of entities. Now we'll see that it's going to do some Mac OS. It's going to do Android. It's going to download a whole bunch of different things that we need for MAUI development. All right, so we have our workload for Maui installed. So now if we do that .NET workload list, we should see Maui. At this point, we should be set up to go through and create a .NET Maui app. We will not be using this option here to create it. We'll go back to our Explorer. We should see that we have a create.NET project. If we click on it, should give us a list of all the templates of projects that we can create. And we can see at the very top, we can create a .NET Maui app. So if I click on that, it's going to ask me what particular directory I want to put it in. And maybe within my RVC folder, I'm going to, I don't want to put it in my OneDrive though. Let's go down to my C drive, put it in my RVC, and make a new folder for Maui. Just going to go ahead and select this folder. It's going to then go ahead and use this project. Usually I'll be giving you some type of a project name, but for this initial assignment, that's fine if we just go ahead and do the Maui app 1. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter. It's going to tell me that it's going to be created in this folder. If I want to continue, I just click on that option. After it processes just a little bit, we can see that we have files that are added up here under the Maui. And we can also see that it has added a Solution Explorer. Typically, when we're working with Microsoft products, doing C# development, we would work within a Solution Explorer, and this is going to provide us that Solution Explorer. We can expand it, we can see our files down here. Now, as we see, we have a dialog that has popped up that is talking to us about showing the output for an Android install that is required. Let's go ahead and show the output. This is going to give us any of the bits that are not quite set. It's going to tell us what file paths it's using and pointing to. It's going to also then tell us if it has any outstanding requirements. So in this case, the build tools are not installed, the command line tools are not installed. I want to go ahead and relaunch my Android Studio. There's a couple different things that I want to look at here. If I go ahead and go to this menu option that appears to be a bunch of lines, it's essentially the file menu. There is a settings option, and I want to go in and take a look at a few things within the settings option. I can understand that my Android SDK location is here. Now, in my case, I'm going to go ahead and use this file path. I'm going to copy it because I've been installing stuff, uninstalling stuff, and I want to make sure that it is set correctly so it's looking in the right location, because I had Visual Studio installed before. It may have some file paths still tied to the Visual Studio installation. So I'm going to come back here, and in order to do this, I can do a Control, Shift, and P and hold down those 3 keys at the same time, and it's going to bring me up with a series of options that I can use. And then one of those options is to configure Android. And I'm going to go ahead and click on it, and I want to set my Android path. And essentially, this is the location that I want to set it to. It's going to go through, redo this check. I'm going to show my output again. And we pretty much still have everything pointing that needs the build tools and the command line tools. But we can see that we are now pointing to the correct location when it's trying to reference where our SDK is that has all these bits that we are needing. With our SDK manager for Android Studio up, let's go ahead and start trying to resolve some of these things. When we are talking about the fact that we have build tools 34 that's not installed, let's go ahead and in our SDK platforms, we have options. It's showing us if for some reason it was coming up and saying that our platform wasn't installed, and right now it's showing us that we have Platform 34 installed. If it wasn't showing up, we would go ahead and select that platform. Here it's showing that we have the upside down cake installed. If we need to go through and do build tools or command line tools, that's going to be on the SDK tools. I can come over here and see that my build tools, it's got 35 RC. I need to make sure that I have 34, so I'm going to go ahead and apply this and say okay, and it should go through the process of downloading that set of tools. I can then always go back to my Visual Studio Code environment, do a Control-Shift-P again, and if I come into my Configure Android this time and try to refresh my Android environment, I'm going to see if I can pick up that it's showing that change. We still have at least one thing that needs to be addressed. If I scroll down here to the bottom, we can see that we now have the build tools resolved. We still have our command line tools that we need to take care of. So if I go back to Android Studio and I minimize the build tools and the NDK, I have my command line tools. I search for the version that they're asking for, which is 11, and I go ahead and apply and say, okay, it's going to install those build tools or command line tools, sorry there. Once I do that, I can come back to Visual Studio, do a Control-Shift-P again, configure my Android, refresh my environment, and notice I do not have a dialog popping up at this point. And when I scroll down, it looks like everything has been resolved as far as my Android tools. Now at this point, I can go ahead and I can run my application. Usually there is like a bug here and there's a big run button. I need to go through and do either a start or a run without debugging them. I'm just going to start debugging. Pick through what I need to do. Usually if you have that button, everything's tied, but because I'm not running that button, it's going to come up with, do you want to allow the platform? So go ahead and say allow for the Java, because the Android emulator is actually running under Java, so we want to make sure that we allow that. And now we have our desktop version of our application. Remember, this is something that we can run on our Windows desktop, so this would be the desktop version. And then we can pick our targets using our Control-Shift-P option as well. This application essentially, as if I click on the button, we can see that it's basically updating the count of times that I click it. So I'm going to close out this. And if I want to go through and target something on the Android side, Control-Shift-P, this time instead of just configuring, we can pick an Android device. And if I click on the picking of the Android device, whichever Android devices are configured, it's going to show me a list of those devices that I can select from. But how is it that I go through the process of trying to define a new device that I can pick from this list? So let's go back to our Android Studio, and I'm going to get out of this dialog. And within our IDE, over at the side, we have a device manager. So if you click over here, it's going to bring up a device manager. We see our Pixel 5. This is the one that we were showing. If I want to add a new device, I'm going to click Add a New Device. I'm going to create a virtual device. This is the emulators that we will see within the application. And I can go through and pick a particular device. I have options here. In this case, I'm going to do the Pixel 8. If I click Next, then I need to pick my system image because it needs to know what system image it's using. I need to go to whichever particular image that I need to choose from. If I go to the x86 images, I can see that I have upside down cake installed here, so I'm going to use this image. If I did not have an image, I could always install the image, but we already have our image. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. It's going to give me options that I can choose to look at it in portrait or landscape mode. I have additional settings that I can do, and I can go ahead and finish. Now, once I do this, I can start my emulator. I like to try to start it to make sure that everything is okay, that it's going to run. And we can see that it's starting up my AVD down here. We don't need to necessarily start our emulators, but I like to do that just to make sure that they're set up and configured correctly and are not going to have any issues before I try to run them in Visual Studio Code. So my device seems to be okay. I'm going to go ahead and try to run against that device. So I'm going to do a Control-Shift-P, and this time I'm going to pick my Android device. We see the Pixel 8. I'm going to go ahead and select the Pixel 8. I can go ahead and, for some reason, now I have my run and debug back. Who knows why? I can click on my run and debug. Not sure that it's actually doing anything, so I'm going to do the start debugging here. I don't think it's done. I think it's going to try to redeploy it. And there we go. I think it's finally done. We can go ahead and click, and we can see that it's updating our buttons with the number of times that we are clicking the application, similar to what we saw on the Windows application. So this is a walkthrough for trying to get the Windows desktop and the Android emulators working within Visual Studio Code for a .NET MAUI project.